Join me in welcoming Simon Longstaff.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to join you this afternoon for this very important conversation you've been having. I just might note the slightly macabre sense of humour of whoever put the program together by giving this final session the topic Final Reflections. Interesting pun. I've been thinking about this gathering for some time, and what I've been thinking about has been reinforced very much by being in the privileged position to listen to some of the conversations that have taken place already. And there are some things that I prepared earlier that I want to talk about, which are about the larger perspective in which we might think about the issue of death and dying and its relationship to life. But there are other things which have emerged from listening and are more personal reflections, and I want to blend those in, and then perhaps at the end of my remarks it may prompt some further reflection from you, some questions you might have for me, or further conversation. One of the things that occurred to me listening to Joel when he was speaking, something I'll come to a little bit later about a particular context for song around dying, was that how many of our rituals in the West at least to do with death are accompanied by silence. And I was thinking about that. Why is it that there is so much of silence? Is it that the words simply fail us when we come to discuss this matter? Is it that we know what we'd like to say but can't say it, in other words, that it's just not able to be expressed? Or is it also that if we're ever going to speak of death, that we inevitably must also speak of life? And the sheer complexity of it and its interrelationship is what brings us to silence, where all we can do is just stop in that moment and think. And if it is that latter reason, then that would be an encouraging thing, I think, that deep down we recognise this interweaving. But it may be something which is at some risk. And one of the things I want to talk about today as a kind of a theme, really, is the way in which our understanding and relationship to death is progressively being separated from life in various ways. I want to talk a little bit about the way in which technology and the practice of medicine might do that. I want to talk a little bit about the way in which our language, our discourse about the things that are important to us, almost inevitably now veer towards an economic calculus which can separate us from life. And I want to talk a little bit about the way in which that latter notion might be made into a personal consideration which has a very profound impact, not just on what it means to die well, but as I'll suggest to you, what that notion means to live well. How do we link those two things together? But before I get into those, let me just speak a little bit personally from my own encounters with death. Some of them have been very immediate in the sense that when quite a young man, having left school at 16, I found myself a few days after my 17th birthday on Groote Island in the Gulf of Carpentaria, where I'd pitched up as what was then called a service attendant, which was a glorified title for cleaner. And then later, through a series of extraordinary opportunities, really, quite accidental interventions in my life, I found myself becoming a safety officer. Now, this was on a remote island in the Gulf of Carpentaria in the mid-1970s. And for those of us who lived in those conditions, and particularly for the Indigenous people with whom I formed a very rich relationship, the provision of normal services that we take for granted was not always available. Even though the mine was run by BHP, there were times there where there was no doctor, very limited services. And as a safety officer, my duties encompassed driving fire trucks and ambulances and things like that, because we were effectively the paramedics. And one night I was coming home from a shift, and saw that there'd been an accident just on the side of the road, and my colleagues in the same line of work had moved to the medical centre, where I joined them, and with a number of nurses worked to try and preserve the life of a man who had wrapped himself around a tree on a motorbike. There was no obvious evidence of trauma, and yet under my hands he died. We could do nothing. It turned out that he'd ruptured his spleen, and with no doctor there, and even just with guidance coming through the radio from Gove, this man passed. And that was my first personal experience of another person dying. And for me it was a very profound moment, as you might imagine. It's probably common for many people throughout the world to encounter death in that way, but it wasn't so common. I think it probably is not still so common for somebody at that age, and perhaps this gender, looking around the room. I mean, I'm struck by the gender mix in the room as well, and wonder what that's telling us too about this particular topic. But that was a very profound moment, to feel that subjective difference of the man being there one moment and not. And then, of course, there was the aftermath of the 15-year-old son, who was only a year or so younger than me. Maybe he was 14, coming in and weeping over his dead father, and then that same body having to put it in a body bag and sling it over my shoulder, and he was in the freezer overnight before being taken to the air ambulance and being sent to Gove. Now, part of the emotional experience for me of this was that my mother had died when I was 7. She'd been ill for a year and a day after giving birth to a 4th child, and she'd been told early on in the pregnancy if that she continued with the pregnancy and had the child, she would die. And yet she was a very devout Catholic who believed that this child should be born, and made the conscious decision that she would proceed with the pregnancy. The thing for me was that when she died, she'd been in hospital, and I hadn't seen her for months. None of us had. My father came home on that particular morning, and I asked him how Mum was, and he said, she was asleep, because he couldn't bring himself to tell us that she was dead. And then about an hour later he brought me in, and I remember sitting on the end of the bed on his knee as he told me. And I think I understood at the time, but later on I heard she was described that she'd been like an angel. Whatever it was that had taken her life had leached all of the colour from her hair and from her skin, and apparently, those of you who probably know whatever it was, but she was just completely white figure as she died. But this is all something which I have to imagine. There was nothing that I could see. There wasn't any experience of that. In a sense, to me, her dying is still a little bit unreal, and I wondered, as I heard Kathy talking about the grandchild being there, what it might have been like for me to see that, and what it could have been if we'd had a society back then which was much more sympathetic to the possibility that when somebody died, and this may have been impractical, but I don't even think the possibility would have been discussed back then that she might have come home, and that we as a family of children and her husband might have experienced that. Well, in the course of the years that have passed, and perhaps there was some link between those experiences, or perhaps it's just an accident, my own professional career has developed so that much of what I do touches on issues to do with life and death. Some of it involves violent death. I work with the military, and there are issues that we have to confront, ethical questions about child soldiers, the ethics of killing and what it means, and respect for bodies on battlefields where those bodies might be booby-trapped, and a whole lot of things which are elemental and unpleasant, and perhaps not even necessary aspects of the world in which we live. But another part of it touches much more closely to the sorts of things which have been discussed today. Some of our work involves providing support to clinicians and to families who are dealing with the immediate challenges of situations in which a person may not be able to speak for themselves and yet are approaching death. And one of the things that I've found extraordinary is how important very simple distinctions can be in terms of trying to help people make better sense of what's occurring. I think everybody in this room, in a way that perhaps is not true of everybody in general society, would know that there's a very significant distinction to be made between prolonging life, which is a noble objective, and the alternative, which can employ exactly the same technology, which is to prolong the process of dying. We have the technology. We can make people die very slowly if we want to. And I think you experienced that with your who was it, your mother?
My mother.
Your mother in England in intensive care. Very few families, if asked to consider whether they wish to prolong the death of their loved ones, would ever choose to do that. And yet, part of the world in which we live, sometimes defined by what people think of as a heroic element within the medical profession, or because we can, we must attitude, we'll see circumstances in which that kind of distinction is simply set aside, and the full weight of what we can do is done simply because we can. And we no longer preserve life as we might honourably do, as I say, but take that alternative path. But even to make that distinction is often to invite controversy and debate about a whole range of topics, as if the only two choices, somebody said to me in a lunchtime break, the only two choices our society will allow will be either this heroic but futile imposition of what might be burdensome treatment on the one hand, or euthanasia on the other hand. And yet there are all sorts of other possibilities in between to do with the way in which people might approach their death. When we come to talk about it, though, when we talk about whether or not we should continue with a treatment, or how we should be with people or when they die, or how we should support them as they die, this process of separation that I was talking about in my introductory remarks, where the notion of death being separated in some senses from a larger narrative about life, that starts to work away. And part of it I've mentioned already is to do with the way in which a technological or technical capacity can take over, in which the fact that we have the means, that they're made to serve ends, even though we have to twist and perhaps corrupt the processes to do this, the way in which systems, structures, policies take on a life of their own and begin to demand an allegiance from us, which stands, if you like, in the face of some more natural experience which we might bring to bear. We need to be able to say that. We need to be able to ask whether or not those strict structures, those policies, those systems, those technologies are serving human interests, or whether or not in some sense they have taken on a life of their own, sometimes because of our desire for control and mastery and a whole lot of other things which run very deep with us, things which are not really appropriate to spend time discussing today, but we should dwell on more generally. But the other thing that happens when we start to talk about these topics is that often it moves away from a discussion about mastery and technique, system and policy, to be a discussion about the economics of it all. What is the appropriate allocation of resources? Should we apply a quantum of efficiency as a value to a consideration of what arrangements should be made in and around the process of death and dying? This recourse to a discourse about economics, where we try to measure the relative value in terms of monetary value of approaches, needs to be seen as not something which is specifically to this particular area, but I think as part of a much larger trend which has taken place in our society, which makes the conversation about these sorts of topics increasingly difficult, particularly if we wish to talk about the ethical dimension. I don't know if you've noticed, but in almost every case of important public policy that arises in society today, you see that the terminal point for the conversation will be somebody commissioning an economics report from someone like Access Economics in order finally to resolve the question. Now, I first noticed this when there was a debate about whether or not to introduce opal fuel into Central Australia to try and alleviate the scourge of petrol sniffing. Everybody knew what to do. I mean, the ability to resolve this was there. And yet it was only when I think a couple of the companies with an interest around that area commissioned Access Economics to look at the relative cost of doing nothing as opposed to bringing in opal fuel, that all of a sudden they said, oh, well, actually, it's cheaper in the long run if we bring in the opal fuel. I noticed that in the debate about the environment, global warming, that at some point the environmental movement itself abandoned any kind of conversation about the importance of other species or future generations and said, let's pin ourselves on to the tale of Lord Nicholas Stern and his analysis that in the long run, if we don't do anything, it'll cost too much. And then at the end of 2008, two charities established to try and combat the evil of child abuse actually commissioned a report from Access Economics to show that child abuse costs too much. Now, I don't want to say that economics is unimportant to our deliberation. I don't want to say that we should be unrealistic about the relative costs of other things, but I do want to sound a warning about a society that feels it needs to answer the problem of child abuse by recourse to economic analysis. There are some things that we ought to be able to talk about and say they are good, or they are bad, or evil, or they are wrong. And that we should have a confidence in the way in which we talk about this without saying, well, ultimately, here's the report that shows that the economics support our case. Now, this is not a comment I seek to make in particular about those instances. Rather, I want to just notice something about the way we talk about things these days. That in some senses, certain ways of talking are no longer treated with the same legitimacy that they might have had in the past. That they've become problematic because they're contestable. And that one of those areas is to do with ethics. The notion that we might talk about something like how we should deal with the ethics of death and dying isn't just difficult because it's a complex area, but because the whole notion of talking about such matters, the whole notion of speaking to the ethical dimension itself, I think, is becoming problematic in a society which doesn't quite know how to have these conversations with the confidence that perhaps once it did. And so when we talk about notions of dying with dignity, which I was fascinated to hear the exchange about what that might mean, we might actually come to a point where we do struggle to say, well, what could this mean? Do we have a language which would explain that? Traditionally, to speak of dignity was to talk of recognising the intrinsic dignity of a person. And so to die with dignity would be in a condition in which that intrinsic dignity was recognised. It might work itself out in a whole lot of different ways, but in a society which is less inclined to speak in those ways and would perhaps calculate the value or utility of a life, then maybe we would see something different emerge from that conversation. And who knows, if we don't redress this, perhaps in another generation the conversation will be even more difficult. Now, that idea about words like dignity and how we think of each other and the context of this relationship between death and life in a fuller sense than just an economic sense has some bearing on the third thing that I wanted to touch upon, which is this notion of dying well. Purely by accident, I was watching television. Well, it's not by accident I was watching television. I had just happened to get back from London on Wednesday night, and I was slightly jet lagged, and so I was sort of channel surfing. And I came across Brideshead Revisited, the movie. And it was only when I was sitting up the back that I sort of made the connection between what I was watching and what's here, because, of course, as you probably know, in the story, and I watched the one with Michael Gambon, who plays this role of Lord Marchmain, who's been in exile in Venice for having broken social convention. What was really interesting was that he decides to come home to die, It's one of those turning moments in the narrative. And when he comes back, there was a whole lot of debate as to whether or not he should be presented by the priest who will give him extreme unction. But at one point, the members of his family, protesting against Charles Ryder's objections to the priest, says, no, father must be given the opportunity to make a good death. He must be able to die well. Of course, I started to think about, well, what's this notion mean? What might it mean today? In ancient times, for people like Aristotle, the notion of dying well was related to the life you'd lived as a whole. I mean, he asks us to imagine each time we act that we're going to lay our head on our pillow for the final time tonight, and there's no undoing of this. Joel, you were talking about singing in Africa. I remember reading somewhere, you may be able to confirm this, that there are some places in Africa where, as you lay dying, they sing to you your life. Just imagine that. What an extraordinary thing it would be, and what a potentially terrible thing it would be. Yeah. I'm thinking about my own life, particularly if they're accurate. But, they would in that setting. They know you, they sing you your life, and your death is not something which is separated from your life. It's a thing which is integrated into it. I think when we think of death and life and its relationship, there's this point at which we begin to see a connection with the terrors that are sometimes expressed about the nature of death, and those same terrors that people so often refer to when speaking of dementia, the loss of the self, dissolution. Some people, from a spiritual perspective, positively seek out the loss of identity, the submersion of the self into some greater form of being. But many people are terrified by it, the sense that you become separated from who you are, and yet the singing of your life. And I would suggest too, perhaps the generic concept of home are places where you anchor your identity. Now, I don't mean home as a particular place with walls, ceilings, driveways, hedges, whatever makes it. Home in this sense might be something both more variable but more substantial. A place, a location, a way of finding meaning, which is where the story of the life, where your identity is expressed. And in that sense, as you die, this connection with life and its dignity, the sense of you, as I say, this intrinsic dignity you have expressed through a life becomes united. But again, there may be challenges for that in this time and place. I'm drawn back in my memory to a newspaper article written by Bob Ellis. It was written in the 1990s, and I may be paraphrasing it now incorrectly, so Bob Ellis, if you ever see this, apologies if I haven't got it precisely right, but the sense I took away from it was that he sought to compare two, I think they were old men, dying alone as it happened, one in the 1950s and one in the 1990s. And Ellis said of the man dying in the 1950s, this person, doesn't matter, gender's not important really, that at that time, this person may very well have died with a sense of contentment, of a life well lived. Why? Because this person would look at the standard of a life well lived as being about whether or not they had done their duty, whether or not they had been faithful to their friends, whether or not the quality of their relationships had been something admirable. And he wondered in this piece as to whether or not the standard for what constituted success, a successful life, in the 1990s had become something altogether different. Whether or not one had an appropriate portfolio of shares, the latest model car, a series of material benefits that were the index of success by that period in time. And the point he sought to make, of course, was that in that earlier period, the kinds of goods that might be enjoyed by a person in the course of their life were available to all. It's a bit like friendship. If we were to do an experiment in the types of goods which are available to us here today, I could do it with, on the one hand having a bowl of Smarties, and there's 100 Smarties in there, I say go for it, and whoever gets as many Smarties as they can, if you get 50, you've got 50, but it means there's only 50 left for everybody else in the room. In that sense, there's a limited pool to be distributed with a zero-sum game. But if I was to say, no, the goods to be distributed are friendships, then you could make as many friends in this room as there are people, and no one would be denied a piece of friendship at all. The quality, the character of these things would be infinitely distributable amongst the group. And Ellis was pointing to that, to the kind of world in which we live, being one in which there was that opportunity by way of honour, duty, friendship, that every person in society could die well in that sense because they had lived well. That if you were to sing their song, you would hear that it being a song of things which anybody, rich, poor or otherwise, could enjoy. So when I think about our conversations today about death and dying, I cannot separate it from a conversation about the kind of society that we are, what we value, the way we discuss these things, the relationship that these things have to our identity and to the meaning that we make throughout our lives. And I wonder, therefore, whether or not the conversation, should it spread from this place, will naturally require us to address a set of deeper, related questions that stem from a concern about death, life, and how we talk about this. That this is the kind of conversation, a seriousness which goes beyond just the immediacy of the topic before us. So to conclude, I think this has been is an important conversation. The fact that I think it so doesn't make it so. It is important. But I worry that it takes place in the context of a society that wants to fracture us, and to have these sorts of conversations in their so-called proper place, that it might be defeated in some sense by the system, whether it's the health system or the technologies or structures that want to keep it in its proper place. Or that it might be fractured by a lack of confidence in the language to deal with these things, which wants to take us to apparently safer territory around things like economics, where this would be in its proper place. Or that the things that we value as making for a good life, the life that you would want to live so that you could also die well, might be fractured by a different notion of what it counts to have been successful in a life in this country or in the world, putting death back into its proper place. I hope that we can resist those things, not to be subverting them just for the sake of subverting them, although I am inclined slightly in that direction, but rather because I think we lose so much if we allow that to happen. And there's a gentle and appropriate way to engage with these things so that the conversations we have are richer and our understanding emerging from discussions of the kind taking place today, that they percolate through our society so that as we live and as we die better. Thank you.